Well, here we are again, looking at a wide variety of random news stories from the 1920s. Just a reminder that I read these articles verbatim, so any bias or inaccuracies are the original authors, not my own. And if you didn't watch my last collection of news stories, I'll leave a link in the description for it, or you can click on the recommendation at the end of this video. But anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. Gunners and Targets in Chicago's Crime War. The Literary Digest, October 30th, 1926. The Windy City is getting the black bottle, according to a writer who has made an intimate study of its present distressful situation. A situation that has found its most emphatic expression at this writing in a local agitation for federal aid to restore order, on the plea that municipal authority has broken down. What is meant by the black bottle is explained by William G. Shepard in the course of a timely article in Collier's, wherein he sets forth that in every glass of Chicago's beer, there are knockout drops, death pellets of graft money, which are poisoning her civic physique. But it needs an anecdote to give the peculiar flavor to that sinister phrase. Mr. Shepard was riding in an automobile across Chicago's business district from State's Attorney Robert E. Crow's office to the City Hall with two well-known beer runners. He owed the courtesy of a ride to the fact that he was accompanied by a policeman well and favorably known to the occupants of the car. The latter had seen Mr. Shepard and the policeman trying to stop an empty taxicab and had good-naturedly picked them up. It was an expensive car, and the two young men in charge of it were expensively tailored. They talked familiarly with the policeman, who at length inquired, "Where's so-and-so?" To which the young man at the steering wheel replied, "No bullet was ever made to fit a hole in that bimbo, so they gave him the black bottle." No elucidation accompanied the statement, and Mr. Shepard was evidently too tactful to confess his mystification. But when the drive was over, he asked the policeman what they had meant by the black bottle. At which the Chicago policeman laughed and said, "Oh, that's some kind of a drink that a fellow thinks is whiskey. Your liver can't digest it, so your clock stops. They must have poisoned that guy because they couldn't bang him." And Mr. Shepard adds his conviction that the great Chicago that no adversity, not even a great fire could kill, is getting the black bottle today. His analysis of the situation was followed by a deadly renewal of the machine gun warfare which has given Chicago a unique eminence in the history of crime. The casualties this time included 2 men killed and 3 wounded. Among the latter is W. W. O'Brien, formerly Assistant State's Attorney, latterly an energetic counsel for accused gang murderers. In a prelude to a graphic narrative of the affray, the Chicago Daily News tells us, "Opposite the place of ambush, the cornerstone of Holy Name Cathedral, scarred by the killer's bullets, offered eloquent comment. Marred but still decipherable is this inscription: In the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow, those that are in heaven and those on earth." Ascribing the assassinations to the savage undercover war of alley buccaneers for advantage in the highly competitive business of supplying the Chicago trade with needle beer and questionable hooch, the news reporter thus assembles the known facts. Late yesterday afternoon, 2 Cadillac cars, one a Phaeton and the other a coupe, drove up in front of Schofield's, formerly O'Banion's, flower store at 738 North State Street. In the Phaeton were Jaime Weiss and Pine, his man at heels. Soon afterward, a Chrysler car pulled up in East Superior Street, just opposite the west curb of State Street, where the Cadillac stood. Murray got out of it and strolled over to sit with Weiss in the big machine. All this time, unseen by anyone, two men watched from a dirty window on the second floor at 740 North State Street. They had a Thompson machine gun, a weapon of the sort used in killing Assistant State's Attorney William H. McSwiggan last spring, beside them, and they had been waiting a long and weary time. The floor behind them was littered with the butts of the dozens of cigarettes they had smoked while killing time. Weiss was under their gun, but they waited. For whom? Drucci? O'Brien? The police do not know, but it is certain that the two waiting men got excitedly busy when a Buick sedan, in which the figures of two men could be seen dimly, drew up on the east side of the street in front of the cathedral. The machine gun was eased to the sill. Weiss also came to life. As if he recognized the newcomers, he jumped out of his Cadillac and started across the street. Murray was behind him. Weiss had reached the car tracks when the dirty, unnoticed window of the $8 a week second-floor front of 740 was flung open to let out a blue muzzle that began to spit fire into the street. Weiss fell. Murray fell. From the Buick sedan, two men jumped and started running. The police say they were O'Brien and his investigator, Jacobson. The gun in the window was rattling like a rivet hammer now, and chips of stone flew from the cathedral front as the bullets pinged against it. O'Brien, running, was knocked down by two bullets that hit him in the middle. As he fell, two more bullets went through his right arm to his breast. Jacobson, legging it in the opposite direction, staggered, then recovered himself and ran on, stumbling on a wounded right leg. From the Cadillac Phaeton, Pine had leapt at the first crack of the gun overhead. He knew what was up. Before he had reached the corner, a shock spun him around and sent him moaning down Superior Street on Jacobson's heels, clutching his belt. He had been shot in the stomach. Perhaps 20 men and women were where they could see the shooting, but they didn't linger to look. As they ran, they got fugitive glimpses, from which the police constructed their picture. One heard the two gunmen in the furnished room upstairs scuffle down the hallway under the load of their machine gun, crash open a rear door, and go scrambling for the back fence. Another glimpsed them running away. A third saw Jacobson and Pine hobble out of sight and put a policeman on their trail. That's about all. The police found O'Brien, Weiss, and Murray lying where they had fallen, with priests from the cathedral trying to help them. Big Tim. Time: July 9th, 1928. At tough preparatory schools and colleges, big boys sell the radiators, fire escapes, bedroom crockery, etc. to smaller boys. In Chicago, big boys sell small boys the privilege of staying in business. Chicago's rackets, as they are called, developed out of the Prohibition graft system, where federal agents extort money from blind piggers for protection. One of the most profitable rackets in the Chicago underworld is in the cleaning and dyeing industry. The profits reach $1,500,000 per annum. Credit for bringing the racket to its Chicagoan perfection belongs largely to Timothy D. Big Tim Murphy, who last week became the late Timothy Murphy. A towering burly who relied largely upon his fists in the hard-shooting environment, he rose to be a political power through the railroad labor unions. Then, with gunmen at his command, he pursued the racket of organizing other unions. Percentages of the dues kept Big Tim and his pretty doll wife in style. But evidently, someone else needed the percentages from the cleaners and dyers, because one night last week, after Big Tim's doorbell had rung and he had answered it, an automobile rolled slowly by in the dark street, spitting a mechanical stream of fire and lead. Big Tim died where he stood. Accustomed to gangster funerals in Chicago, the United Press issued a laconic bulletin on the Murphy ceremony before it took place. A cortege a mile long, with scores of automobiles bearing floral tributes, etc., etc. But the UP guessed poorly. Chicago is changing a little. The Chicago Crime Commission, under a small, fearless 76-year-old lawyer named Frank J. Loesch, has set out to clean up the crime capital of the U.S., beginning at the top with Chief of Police Michael Hughes. In the old days, it was a mark of distinction to be seen at gangster funerals, but during the Loesch prosecutions, probably not even U.S. Senator Deneen of Illinois would care to be seen near the bier of a racketeer. Behind the Murphy bier, instead of the United Press's mile-long cortege, were just 20 automobiles, no crowd, no color. Said the hard-boiled Chicago Tribune, "The burghers will be inclined to rejoice." That is the short view. The man who killed O'Banion was tougher and more resourceful than O'Banion. The man who killed Jaime Weiss was tougher than his victim. And the man who killed Murphy was a harder egg than Murphy. As one gangster is killed off, he is succeeded by another who is less restrained by the standards of civilized society. The progression is from fists to bombs to pistols or to machine guns. The Murphy murder quickly reverberated in Brooklyn, New York. Frank Wale, alias Yale, dressy gangster and racketeer, friend of Alphonse Scarface Al Capone of Chicago, was cruising comfortably in his shiny Lincoln sedan. Another car with Illinois license plates slid up behind. 4 men opened fire at the back of Wale's head, then drew alongside and shot off the side of his face. The Lincoln careened off the street, through a hedge, against a brick stoop. The Illinois car vanished. Girl slurred by boy lover borrows gun and shoots him. The Washington Times, May 14, 1922. Through the shadows of the grove around the Mountain View Church one night recently, the throngs of young people going into the dance saw a slim figure flit behind a big palm tree. They thought it was a little boy in overalls, with a toy pistol dangling from a wide cavalryman's belt around his waist, come to play pranks on the merrymakers. And they laughed at the youngster, until Harold Galloway, a 17-year-old high school student, went out to see what the child was up to. There was a rustle of leaves as the figure, dodging, fell. Sharp words came fast and then, "Oh, I thought I was too low for you to speak to in public." It was the voice of a girl in hot anger, but before they could identify it, a spurt of flame illumined the struggling couple, and the boy crumpled up in a heap among the leaves. When the dazed crowd, streaming out of the parish house, reached them, the little overalled figure was shaking with sobs, and in the glare of flashlights, they recognized Irene Granstedt, the 14-year-old sweetheart of the wounded lad. She was weeping. "Oh, I didn't mean to hurt you, Harold. It went off by accident. Please speak to me." She was dabbling at one of his bleeding fingertips with a handkerchief. But when the unconscious youth was carried into the parish house, it was found that the bullet, after clipping the end of his finger, drilled into his abdomen, perforating his intestines in 12 places. Death, the doctors said, was only a matter of days. Irene, at once pathetic and ludicrous in her overalls, a slip of a girl who looked 2 years younger than the 14 accredited her, fought for an opportunity to help. With violet eyes sparkling in grief and terror, and blonde bobbed hair streaking across her tear-spattered face, She appeared a distraught child, and they did not even bother to summon an officer to arrest her. When the dying lad was taken to the Red Cross hospital and the dancers, who had been interrupted by the tragedy, sifted home in frightened groups, the girl stumbled out across the fields to her own little home, 2 miles away. She went to bed without undressing and without speaking to her parents of what she had done. At dawn, the sound of hammering on the door startled her. She heard the voices of her parents in angry protest, and then the call of the impatient sheriff. "Oh, open up and bring out the murderess. What do you think I'm here for?" In that gentle fashion was the news broken to Irene's mother and father. Panic-stricken, the girl ran down the stairs into the open arms of her dumb-stricken mother. The sheriff pulled her away and lifted her into his car, throbbing in the roadway. 10 minutes later, before the family could grasp what it all meant, Irene was in San Jose prison, in the custody of probation officer Catherine Bratton, pending the result of Galloway's injuries and the action of the grand jury and the county prosecutor. She told Miss Bratton that she and Harold had been sweethearts, and that he became jealous when she went out with another youth. They had quarreled. He had declared in the schoolyard that she was so low that he wouldn't speak to her again in public. He had not invited her to the parish house, nor had anyone else. Humiliated and angry, she said, she had borrowed the pistol from a neighbor's boy, Curtis Morgan, and had gone to make Harold apologize. In the dispute, she had threatened him. He had dared her to shoot. And then, as he sought to wrest the weapon from her, the cartridge was exploded. Hysterical at the recollection of it, she insisted that it was all an accident. With the sheriff, the school principal, the county physician, and the probation officer, Irene was hurried to the hospital to face the dying boy. Gulping, she attempted to speak, but the words would not come. Young Galloway, conscious temporarily, started at her slowly, then smiled and said, "Hello, Irene." The boyish prisoner tried to smile back as the sheriff reminded the patient that he was dangerously injured and requested that he make an explanation of the shooting. The lad's eyes slowly swept the circle of faces, then rested on the agonized features of the girl. For a full minute, there was silence. Then he said, clearly and with evident effort, "Irene did not mean to do it. It was an accident. I ask that no charge be brought against her." Again the smile, and the eyes closed. The boy's beau jest was done. Irene Grandstedt swayed against the sheriff, then recovered herself with an effort as they led her back to the automobile and the prison. By a queer twist of destiny's threads, Mrs. J.C. Galloway, mother of the wounded lad, was in a nearby room of the hospital, awaiting the birth of a child. She was not informed of the shooting. Back in the Grandstedt cottage, the girl's father, Theodore, who keeps the local store, was mending a drain pipe. Asked what he intended to do to help Irene, he answered curtly, "Irene is my daughter. I don't know the circumstances of the case yet, and I won't talk about it." Inside the cottage, the fear-shaken mother of the girl said, "My husband never liked Irene, and now he blames me for this trouble. But maybe if he hadn't been so harsh with her, I would not have been so easy. He never wanted her to go to parties. She was afraid of him. Do you think she would have come home in the night and crept into bed with that terrible thing on her mind if she felt that she could have come into our room and told her trouble to her mother? But she was afraid of her father. I don't know the whole story, but I can't believe that she meant any wrong. I don't believe that she meant to shoot anyone." The mother's eyes filled, and she recalled her own girlhood on a Kansas farm, where she had grown up in terror of her parents, adding, "Once, I too went out to a church party without asking permission, because I knew I wouldn't get it. When I got home, I was met with a long black horsewhip, and oh, what a terrible beating I got." The woman shuddered and went on. "My heart closed against my mother and father that night, and they wouldn't even let me go out with my own brothers after dusk." So, remembering how I was brought up, I guess, maybe I was too easy with Irene, but her father was too harsh. Mrs. Granstead paused, and her mind went back to the night before, as she said, "You heard Irene wrote poetry. Yes, she was always writing it, but she didn't read it to us. She used to lock it in her hope chest upstairs with all the other things she was saving. She was always kind and sweet to me. She left me that night early, saying she was going out with a friend for a while. I saw her a moment as she came in, and I thought by the look in her eyes that something terrible had happened. But she went straight to bed without talking at all, and I heard her moaning and crying, but I couldn't go in and ask her what was wrong, for she and her father do not get along friendly now, and I was afraid of her. But Teddy, the 13-year-old brother of Irene and Vivian, the baby of the family, red-eyed from weeping, begged for news of their sister, and assured visitors that she just couldn't have done anything wrong, and was she coming home soon? Would the visitor tell her that the boys and girls at the school were awful sorry for her? Mrs. Sadie Morgan, the nearest neighbor, with Curtis and the other children around her, was trying too, but she said, "My boy knew nothing about this affair. Little Irene came to us in the afternoon and asked if she could borrow a gun because she was going to a picnic next day. My husband always keeps several revolvers, and Curtis, who shoots at target practice, thought she wanted to use a pistol at a picnic match. He got her a gun and buckled the belt and holster around her waist. I wasn't paying much attention. I did not notice if she acted unusually. I certainly can't believe that child would do such a thing." And Curtis, also a high school boy, sturdily corroborated what his mother said, his freckled face paling as he thought of the shooting. An odd phase of it is that the sheriff is finding it difficult to get any witnesses to testify against Irene, for despite the throngs at the dance, all assert that they were inside the building or far from the scene when the pistol flashed in the darkness. This is particularly odd, because Irene's affair with the older boy had brought public censure on them months ago. Complaint has been made to the juvenile court, and young Galloway's parents had been considering the advisability of sending him to the city to break off the infatuation. But the elfish beauty of the girl, her poetic precocity, and her hoyden spirit had won her a warm place in the hearts of the townspeople, even though they shook their heads over her wildness, and she seems not to have lost them since that black night in the Mountain View Grove. KKK. The Outlook. January 9th, 1924. No one who knows the Outlook needs to be told that it is not impressed by mummeries, that it does not consider masked night riders as normal agents of civilization, that it regards as a menace any form of invisible government, and that it wishes to bear its part in joining with all good Americans in opposing racial or religious prejudice. At least, we should not have supposed that no one who knew the Outlook needed to be told that, if it were not for Judge Steele's letter. So, to make matters perfectly clear, we say it here explicitly. 2 years ago, when the Ku Klux Klan in its modern form came to public notice, it did not, as we said at the time, seem to be a great or serious menace. In fact, its obviously absurd nomenclature was alone enough to make serious discussion of it difficult. Attempts to parody Klan language and Klan custom were scarcely, if at all, more amusing than Klan language and custom themselves. For 2 years, however, the Ku Klux Klan has been growing rapidly in membership and in power. The very fact that it has been hard for many people to take it seriously has deprived opposition to it of much of its vigor. No one apparently knows what its total membership is now, but estimates, which seem not extravagant, place it in the neighborhood of 3 million. If this number is near the truth, the Ku Klux Klan constitutes an army half again as large as that which the United States sent to France. the Ku Klux Klan has appeared in power in states as widely separated as Texas and Oregon. It is a political power in such populous and important states as Indiana and Ohio. Those who have despised it can afford to despise it no longer. They may hate it, they may fear it, but they cannot treat it safely with contempt. It is because the Ku Klux Klan had become a serious factor, not only locally but nationally, that we asked Stanley Frost to make a study of the organization and to report his findings in the articles which are now in the course of publication in the Outlook. We did not commission him either to defend or to attack the Klan. We commissioned him to ascertain the facts and report them. He has reported alike facts which seem to be in favor of the Klan and facts which seem to be against it. He has reported its strength and its weakness. Wherever it seemed to have served a useful purpose, he has been as ready to tell what it has done as where it has proved to be a menace. Mere indignation and denunciation will not serve those who wish to restrain or destroy an organization of this sort. In order to deal with its undoubted dangers, Americans must know something of its purposes, its methods, and the extent of its success, and must understand the circumstances which have not only called it into being, but given it its power. As we said in introducing Mr. Frost's articles, not only for those who wish to defend the Klan, but for those who wish to fight it, the only ammunition that will serve consists of facts. By presenting these facts to our readers, we believe we are doing them the greatest service we can render in respect to the Klan. Upon these facts, each reader can base his own opinion. But we believe that there are certain points which our readers should bear in mind as they read Mr. Frost's articles. In the first place, no movement of this sort can arise without a cause. It is not within the power of any man or group of men to foist an organization of the Klan's dimensions upon the public. The Ku Klux Klan has spread in response to a demand on the part of a large proportion of Americans for some expression in protest against alien influence. The same phenomenon appeared in Italy. There, an alien influence had started to break down the nation. It had disintegrated industry. It had paralyzed government. It was non-Italian, for it was destroying the power and morale of the Italian people. Whether we like the fascisti or not, we must recognize that their rise into power was in response to a need which no one else was ready to fill. The result is that Italy has again become Italian. There is likewise a disintegrating force in America, or rather, there are disintegrating forces. We have been importing not only alien persons, but alien ideas. Many of the very people who come to this country because it is great and rich and strong and free have done their utmost to belittle all that has made it such, and some of these have agitated and organized to destroy the institutions on which the present strength and freedom of America rest. It is because the Ku Klux Klan has been the only organization that has given nationwide expression to the protest against these disintegrating forces that it has gained its power. The American Legion might have led, but it has thrown away its opportunity by seeking a bonus for its members. Political leaders might have made an issue of it, but they have been prevented by their fears or the fears of their followers. Condemnation of the Klan, no matter how well deserved, will not check its growth until something better and saner will meet the need which it has undertaken to supply. In the second place, whatever its service, the Klan is essentially a dangerous organization for any civilized community. Whether it is lawless or not, and that at present is at least debatable, it is so organized as to be useful for lawless purposes, with a minimum of danger to itself. As Mr. Frost pointed out in his last article, it can strike in the dark and leave no clue. There have been times in America when the only method for securing order was that of the Vigilance Committee. It is unfortunately true that in some regions today, where hijackers and bootleggers flourish, lawless criminals seem to create a supply for equally lawless suppression. The cure for lawlessness, however, is not through more lawlessness, but through the development of public opinion upholding the law. Those who wish to see the Ku Klux Klan destroyed had better put themselves to work in restraining the evils which the Ku Klux Klan professes to avert or to check. A masked organization whose very membership is a secret ought not to be tolerated in America. In the third place, whatever provocation there has been for protest against the alien spirit in America, there can be no permanent place in this land for any organization that judges men by race or religion. The greatest weakness of the Ku Klux Klan lies in the fact that in its very attempts to preserve the American spirit, it denies it. To put all Jews in one class because some Jews have corrupted the theater and the moving picture industry, to denounce all Roman Catholics because the Catholic Church has exercised such political power in New York as it did when it broke John Purroy Mitchell because, for the sake of orphan wards of the city, he defied the hierarchy. To ban all Negroes because some Negroes are disorderly or ignorant or arrogant is to make sport of the very institutions and ideals which the Klan professes to uphold. The deadliest tornado in American history. The Literary Digest, April 4th, 1925. Surgeons working in semi-darkness performed major operations out of doors without anesthetics. In several cities, the dead were laid out in windrows, with so few of their neighbors left alive that identification was almost impossible. With its record of from 800 to 1,000 dead and perhaps 3 times as many injured, with half a dozen towns practically wiped out and the destruction of property amounting to more than $500 million, the tornado that swept down the Ohio Valley on March 18th takes its place as one of the major catastrophes of recent times. Except in its magnitude, however, and its appalling death list, the storm differed little from the windstorms which a New York editor calls an erratic, unpredictable, and inescapable condition of life in the Middle West. Last summer, it is recalled, a tornado went through Lorain, Ohio with calamitous results, and if similar storms never caused so great a disaster before, they have left many long and bloody records. The tornado just passed is called A Typical Midwestern Springtime Storm by Professor Henry J. Cox, government forecaster at Chicago. It originated, he says, over the Gulf of Lower California, passed harmlessly over Colorado, dipped into Arkansas, and then took the path of least resistance along the Ohio Valley. There, its major force was spent, and it rushed off on a high wind in the direction of Iceland. The cause of the storm is found, according to Professor Cox, in the heated air of springtime in certain regions, striking colder waves from the north. The result is a large circular movement of air over a large area, technically called a cyclone. Tornadoes, varying from a mile to 5 miles in length, develop on the edges of cyclones and cause the damage by their violent movement. The course of the recent storm, with the peculiar branch tornadoes striking off from the main path, is shown in the accompanying map. The tornado took its toll over a path of 300 miles in 5 hours, and the appearance of the deadly wind was so sudden that there was no possibility of preparing against it. Whole towns were destroyed. A brakeman on an Illinois Central train who witnessed the tragedy at DeSoto, Illinois, described it as a crash of thunder preceded by 2 blinding flashes of lightning, after which there was nothing left. A former war chaplain said the devastated district could be likened to the war zone in France. There was no other comparison. A small part of the record of tragedy runs, as reported by a correspondent of the New York Times, human bodies in almost every form of cremation and butchered or crushed were removed from the debris. Only comparatively few were found intact. Identification is being made by rings on detached arms in some instances. Bodies pierced with splinters of wind-driven wood are frequent. The little hamlet of DeSoto probably suffered the heaviest single catastrophe inflicted by the tornado, for it was here that 118 men, women, and children died, many of them in the schoolhouse, which was razed in the twinkling of an eye. 9 bodies were found huddled about a coal stove in a Griffin restaurant, partly cremated. In one Illinois town, the fire engine itself was burned into uselessness. Murfreesboro, Illinois had to improvise a pumping plant on the ruins of its waterworks before the fires could be extinguished. At Annapolis, a quick-thinking station agent used his cash drawer successfully as a bucket to extinguish fire. So tremendous was the force of the wind that in Murfreesboro, 11 locomotives were reported wrecked, 6 of them of the heavy type. Heavy objects were found several miles from their original positions, and papers were carried 50 miles. Freakish dips of the twister left the usual safe spots in the path of the storm. One mine clerk saved himself by crawling into his office safe, which protected him from fire and falling walls. One family crept under their motor car when the house fell and tumbled over the machine. All but one of 75 girls employed in a Heinz plant at Princeton escaped unhurt. The town's $2 million Southern Railroad yard was wrecked. The Mobile and Ohio shops were a total loss at Murfreesboro, as well as a new $267,000 addition to its high school and a $25,000 Baptist church. A schoolhouse near Cape Girardeau, Missouri, was carried away a short time after its pupils had been discharged. Fate was not so kind in other places where schools were demolished. Another strange freak of the storm was reported from Princeton, Indiana, where 4 miners en route to their home from a mine were lifted bodily from the small automobile in which they were riding and deposited unhurt at the roadside by the wind. Their car was swept away. A 17-year-old Princeton boy was credited with saving the lives of his mother and 2 brothers, whom he huddled on the floor of their home and covered with a rug. The rug was strewn with broken glass and debris when the roof was blown away. A letter bearing a Poseyville postmark was picked up near Bloomfield, more than 100 miles away. A rescue worker, noticing a baby's shoe protruding from the debris of a miner's home, grasped it to find Becky Reed under the wreckage. She was unhurt. A grain elevator was moved intact to the middle of a road, 40 feet away. In only one instance was damage to a train reported. W.E. Lemley, tie inspector for a Poplar Bluff, Missouri lumber company, was in a restaurant eating when the storm struck. The roof went off first, he said, and then all 4 sides were swept away. I was left sitting on the floor with nothing around me. Then I left. The Missouri Pacific Depot at Annapolis was hit by the storm. The bay window at which the agent, W.C. Gunther, sat remained intact, and timbers supporting the window still stood upright after the storm. Several persons were pinned beneath falling timbers in the waiting room. A mother at DeSoto, lying in bed with her 2-week-old baby, escaped death when her home collapsed and the timbers fell across the bed in such a manner as to protect her and the baby. The Illinois Central Bridge on the Ziegler Branch shifted 6 feet from its concrete pillars. Freaks of the storm were frequent everywhere. A barber's chair was found deposited in an open field, miles from any town where there had been a barber shop. Automobiles were lifted off the roads and thrown, crushed, into vacant lots. A Victrola was noticed in a field near Princeton, Indiana. Underclothing decorated the treetops. A New York Evening World correspondent relates these other incidents of the Indiana city. T.H. Phillips sat in the office of his coal scale shop by the Southern Railroad tracks. A big colored man was with him. "Guess it's going to storm, Jim," said Phillips, noticing the darkness of the sky. A minute later, Phillips felt himself lifted with his office furniture and hurled outside into the mud. Jim had disappeared. Phillips buried his head in the mud and thought he was gone. The cloud lifted, and he was alive. He found Jim under a pile of soft coal, alive. $1,000 in bills were lost. 2 fine automobiles were gone. L. Montgomery, who lives near the schoolhouse, was saved by the kitchen table, which held the fallen roof from crushing him. Mrs. George Wallace, who lived next door, was blown against the fireplace and killed. The Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the churches, and clubs all joined in the work of relief. "I've got 18 in my family," said a laborer who has taken in the homeless. "They can stay as long as they need to." That is the spirit of this stricken town. Girls are out collecting relief funds on the streets. The churches are giving free meals to the suffering. The hospitals have secured nursing aid from the mothers of the town. If the storm came suddenly, human sympathy responded as quickly. The tornado was at its work of destruction, all told, for a period of about 5 hours, and in less than that time, help and comfort were being rushed to the survivors. The Red Cross sent supplies from St. Louis. Chicago offered $500,000. The Illinois legislature appropriated a like amount. The Missouri legislature $25,000, and the Southern Illinois American Legion $6,000. Legion members were out everywhere, acting as police in the devastated district, bearing such aid and comfort as they could. An airplane view is supplied in a special dispatch to the New York Times from an observer who wrote his story as the plane carried him above the devastated district. His dispatch is dated, "An airplane 2,000 feet above Princeton, Indiana, March 19th. Fretted clouds stare brazenly late today as the 3 prairie states prepare their tornado dead for burial. A menacing wind shrieks of sudden death through the struts of a tiny airplane, dark-winged against the lowering sky. The wind is the tail feather of the tornado which killed 900. Below is a little city, impotent after this, the latest lesson on the weakness of humans. The airplane is just finishing a tour of a large part of the district devastated late yesterday afternoon. From the vantage of the air, it was painfully easy to trace the serpentine course of the demon of the winds. Like a huge boa constrictor, it wound its way over the 3 commonwealths, crushing all in its path. Hours of aimless sauntering through the sky, now at 90 miles an hour, now almost stationary under the onslaughts of the vicious currents, left the aerial observer numb to emotion as the panorama of disaster unfolded beneath him. It is hard to describe, even as cold fingers try to convey to the knee-born typewriter the message that the eyes see far below. We have left behind us Murfreesboro, Illinois, with its 100 corpses, West Frankfort with its 350 crowding the morgues, and we travel high and rapidly over the rich farmland of southern Illinois. It's a great checkerboard. The owner of this piece of land has plowed his land recently, making a brown square, or a black. The next plot has grown over with early grass and forms a green block. Occasional trees dot the sections, trees that look like the little sets in toy Swiss chateaus. Houses are few and rare. Suddenly appears a vacant space where it is apparent a house should be. There is a barn with a few cows huddled near for warmth, and there is a boxed hedge, lining what was once the entrance walk to a fine, solid American home. At a signal, pilot Joe James of Chicago, weary from the tedious battling with the winds from checkerboard field to this scene of horror, noses down sharply, cuts off his motor, returning the power occasionally with staccato chatter. Down and down we go, to flatten out a scant 100 feet over the farm. There is a cellar we find. One can see the potatoes and other products for home still in their neat barreled rows, but there is not a semblance of a home, not even a scrap of torn timbering. And in front of this fallen hearthstone, this instant crushing of the toil of a lifetime, an old man and a woman stand and gaze vacantly into the pit. No, their arms are not around each other. Steadfast, even in defeat, as the fictionists would have it, they stand apart, bent and gray, so hopeless that neither can add to the other's burden by a touch of tears. 5 miles speed fast when the airways roar. There in the long trail, we find the answer to the mystery behind us. For more than a mile, this Illinois farmer's home had been laid down, a piece here, a timber there, like jackstraws lengthened out. Down we zoom again. This time, the unusual object against the flat earth is the body of a cow, plucked from its evening meal, hurled through the air, and dropped as a shapeless mass. The journey is nearly over, and the headwinds shriek as they try once more to tear us down. Now we are over Princeton. We circle round and round. Long since, the futile sun has given up its foolish battle with funereal clouds. Purple shadows came rushing from the peaceful west. But there is no peace in Princeton. 1/4 of it has been destroyed. We swoop down closer. A huge factory has had its roof and insides sucked out by the wind. Another plant, apparently a railroad car shop, has been wrecked. Hundreds out of work probably, to add to the burden of woe. And, as we find later, 21 bodies are beneath the rows of white sheets. In Princeton, as elsewhere, are the same numb groups of 2s and 3s on every street corner. The same silent throng in front of the Clarion office, reading the bulletins, and in front of the morgue, waiting for another body to be brought from the shattered heaps in the ravaged area. Pilot Joe James has had enough. He raises an inquiring brow and gets an affirmative answer. He tilts the stick, and we tear through the dusk as if the plane seeks to pay some vengeance to the element that turned to demon. It is dark as we flatten out over the land. Firefly lights flicker on, one by one, in the homely kitchens of the city of despair. Night spreads its soft wings in a kindly shield over the wounded town. Marines mourn Sergeant Major Jiggs, mascot of hard-hitting corps. The New Britain Herald, January 12, 1927. Sergeant Major Jiggs was the greatest devil dog of all times. Not that the Sergeant Major, celebrated mascot of the Marines, was a devil of a dog. He was, forsooth, a good dog, and a thoroughbred to boot. When taps were sounded over the mortal remains of the Sergeant Major Tuesday morning at Quantico, Virginia, with 800 Marines standing at attention, the while his comrades lowered their mascot's remains neath the green-tufted earth of the athletic field, his old romping grounds, there passed into Marine history one of the greatest characters that ever wore a uniform. Jiggs was a top sergeant in every sense of the word. He had all the characteristics of men who wore the same kind of chevrons. He even smoked a pipe at odd moments. And once in a while, he took a chew of picnic twist, though he never once tasted Navy cut. Sergeant Major Jiggs was true to the Marines. For others, it might be the Army and the Navy forever, but to the old sergeant, it was always the Marine and Semper Fidelis. Jiggs joined the Marines when he was 2 years old. General Smedley Butler, in command at Quantico, was asked by the Leathernecks to get them a mascot. There was a debate as to just what would make a good mascot for the Marines. The Navy has a goat, the Army a mule. Expert authority agreed that something significant and, if possible, symbolic of Marine standards should be adopted. During the World War, when the boys who wore the khaki went over the top and met the enemy face to face, the cohorts of the House of Hohenzollern, when they bumped into United States Marines, came to call their antagonists devil dogs. Out of this came the idea of having a bulldog for the Marine mascots. Smedley Butler and his companions in the Corps instigated a nationwide search for a dog that would be in every way typical of what Germans called the Marines. They found one in Philadelphia. He was Jiggs. Bulldogs, as a rule, are nobody's beauties. They have underslung jaws, protruding teeth, beetling brows, and cauliflower ears, enough to scare the average mortal out of his wits. Old Jiggs, even in his babyhood, was about as ugly as they came. As years fell on his shoulders and wrinkles came one by one on his wizened face, he betook unto himself a likeness that was anything but beautiful, except to the true experts who recognize in these characteristics of a bulldog the markings of a master. In his second year, Jiggs was the youngest Marine ever to enlist in the service. He was brought from Philadelphia to Quantico and placed in the ranks as a buck private. That was back in 1922. Immediately, Jiggs became a favorite with the men. He took to Marine life from the very outset and became mascot of all the various athletic teams, beginning a career that was to stamp him, at the time of his death, the greatest traveled dog ever associated with a military outfit, with one possible exception: the late Stubby mascot of the Yankee Division, AEF, from New Britain, Connecticut. Jiggs had not been a buck private very long when he was elevated to the rank of lance corporal by the boys who led him on a leash down at Quantico. This, of course, was more or less unofficial. But sometime later, the then Secretary of the Navy, Denby, himself once a Marine, on a visit to Quantico, thought that the dog should have a higher rating and lifted him to the rank of sergeant. About a year and a half ago, Secretary of the Navy Wilbur was down at Quantico one day addressing the boys when Sergeant Jiggs stepped out on the platform. Immediately, there was a great roar from Jiggs's comrades. Secretary Wilbur saw that he was a favorite. Noting the chevrons on Jiggs's blanket, those of a field sergeant, the head of the United States Navy asked the men if they thought Jiggs did not deserve a higher rating. They shouted in unison, "Sure, Pop." "What do you want him to be?" asked the secretary. An old-timer in the front row shouted, "Make him a top sergeant." And this is how the old fellow who died last Sunday came by his chevrons. Though Jiggs had attained the ripe old age of 8, pretty high in the kingdom of dogdom, since specimen of the bull rarely if ever lived beyond 10 years, his death, nevertheless, was considered premature by Marines who were in close contact with him. For they figured that old Jiggs was one of those institutions that, moss-covered and all as they might be, go on forever. 800 Marines at Quantico are in mourning for Jiggs. This is not the full quota usually stationed at this post. Otherwise, there would be 3,500 of his buddies mourning his loss down there tonight. At the time Jiggs decided to shake his earthly cares off his shoulders, most of the men who had grown attached to him were away from the Old Bailiwick. 2,500 of them were doing duty throughout the 48 states guarding the mails. Another batch was plowing its way through the Gulf Stream going to Nicaragua, where there are momentous happenings. Still another complement was on the high seas headed for the tropical posts in South America and out-of-the-way stations in China. All Marine posts and ships were notified by radio of Jiggs's death. Old Jiggs was a buddy to almost every man at Quantico, especially the sergeants, and more especially the top kicks. He was quite a sociable cuss. Every night he made the rounds, an old rounder. He started at one end of the post and went to the other, visiting all his old cronies, spending 5 or 6 minutes with each. If he failed to show up at any given time, there was anxiety on the part of the men and a search for Jiggs. This all came under the head of routine in a way, and was what might be known as the private life of Sergeant Major Jiggs. His public career was what seemed to interest him most. He was more at home with the multitudes, a dog among men and women. Wherever he went, Jiggs attracted attention. He accompanied the Marine baseball and football teams on all their journeys north, east, south, and west. He cheered for them, pulled for them, barked heavily over their victories, grit his teeth in the face of their defeat. It was said of Jiggs that he had a fine sense of intuition, that he knew instinctively when the team, baseball or football, was going to win or lose. Members of the football team swear that whenever a touchdown was about to be scored, old Jiggs immediately began to chew on a bench. That he divined the impending score even before spectators, officials, or participants knew what was coming. There is an old sideline bench that does duty in this biggest athletic stadium in Washington, and one end of this has been completely chewed off by Jiggs. It is the bench that did duty when the Marines walloped the Army in football to the tune of 27-7. As soon as touchdowns started coming, or were on their way, Jiggs began chewing the bench. In all his public appearances, Jiggs was in full regalia. He wore with pride his chevrons of a sergeant major, the highest rank held by a non-com. Down at Quantico, there is an official service record book, which was closed with a final entry today, wherein is inscribed all of Jiggs's military record. There was kept entries of his travels, and the allowances and pay duly accorded him as a cog in the great machinery of the Marines. When Jiggs traveled, he went in state. Always on trains where there was an overnight jump, he rode in the Pullman cars. His sleeping quarters were in the smoker, where usually the grinning Georges shake down the seat and turn it into a cot for their own comfort. But one look at Jiggs and any self-respecting porter always made a hasty exit from the smoker, and usually was never seen until the train reached its destination or Jiggs got off. Consequently, whenever the officers and men of Quantico traveled with Jiggs, they were always minus the services of a Pullman porter. With his service cap tipped rakishly over his right eye, the brilliant brass of his collar shined to the burnishing point, and his chevrons and metal bedecking his blanket, old Jiggs cut quite a figure. So much so, in fact, that he was the center of all eyes wherever he appeared. In Grand Central Station, New York, when the Marines were on their way to play the University of Dartmouth the past football season, Jiggs blocked traffic on 7th Avenue when blasé New Yorkers stopped to have a look at him. He reveled in attention. He not only got it, but demanded it. His Marine companions saw that Jiggs was accorded all honors. He is the only dog who ever went in through the front door of Old Madison Square Garden, and the only one who came out the same way. In telling of this, Major J.C. Fagan, who for 5 years traveled with Jiggs, covering more than 100,000 miles by airplane, trains, and trucks, said, "A hard-boiled old doorkeeper at Madison Square Garden, when he wanted to take Jiggs in to hear one of John Philip Sousa's band concerts, for Jiggs was a great lover of music, shouted at Big Jim Ballas, who usually took care of Jiggs, 'Where are you going with that dog?' Ballas told him, 'Into the garden.' 'Oh, no, you're not,' yelled the old man. 'For 20 years I've been on guard here, and no dog has ever come through this front door, not even for a dog show.' 'Well,' said Big Jim Ballas, 'here's where a novelty greets your eyes. This is Sergeant Major Jiggs of the United States Marines, and where he wants to go, he goes.' And Jiggs went in, with about 200 Marines escorting him. Music seems to hurt the ears of dogs, but old Jiggs simply reveled in the strains of a brass band or the tones of an organ. In a parade, he was always 5 or 6 paces ahead of the drum major, keeping step to the rhythmic beat of the drum. The calisthenics of the slide trombone were mystifying to him, and out of the corner of his eye, he always watched the slip horn artist in the band. The piercing notes of the cornet, even when they were sometimes sour, were music to his ear. Down at Quantico, there is an old organ that some of the men play of nights. Always, Jiggs was there to hear the soothing strains of the staid old instrument. He was, too, a movie fan, going with the boys into the darkened hall every night to watch the flickerings on the screen. Especially, he loved to watch the acting of his only rival in public popularity, Rin Tin Tin. Once in a while, when there were pictures of lesser canine celebrities, old Jiggs regarded them disdainfully from the corner of his eye. Most bulldogs are fighters. Though Jiggs was a member of the Fighting Marines, he was only in one fight in all his career with the military organization. He was born too late to see service in the World War, and thus was never in active combat, save on a memorable occasion when the Marines went out to St. Louis to play a football game. There he was nipped by the bear mascot of the state university, who was later sent scurrying to his dugout by the old top sergeant. This was his only scurry, and he came out victorious. He paid no attention whatsoever to the Army mule or the Navy goat. Though both topped him in height, he seemed to consider them beneath him. He was a top sergeant in the Marines, and they were just a goat and a mule. Jiggs had 2 official caretakers. One of them was a sergeant who has spent 29 years of his life following the flag. He is Sergeant John Nicholas, a trooper who has seen service wherever the Marines landed. He was with them in the Boxer Uprising, and has followed the flag over the 7 seas, around the world and back again. Old Sergeant Nick, they say, cried like a baby when Jiggs answered his last call to duty. The second caretaker was Big Jim Ballas, Corporal, the outstanding star pitcher of the Marines. Last year, he pitched 2 no-hit games, and the best rooter he had on the sidelines was Sergeant Major Jiggs, who at the close of every inning ran out to carry in the veteran's glove. Jiggs came by his moniker naturally. There was a cast in his countenance closely resembling that of a celebrated character in the comic strips. Though Jiggs was quite a man with the ladies, petted and pampered by them on all his visits away from the army post, nevertheless, there was in his life no Maggie. A bachelor born, a bachelor he remained. Jiggs was sick only a day. As soon as his symptoms became serious, his buddies rushed him by airplane to Washington, where he was placed in the care of the best veterinarians in the city. He had a trained nurse in attendance upon him in his last hours, and when death finally visited the old boy, his comrades in arms had one of the leading undertakers in the nation's capital take Jiggs's old kennel and make of it a casket. An airplane squadron flew with his remains from Washington to Quantico, Virginia, where the night before his burial, the old sergeant major lay in state. Past the little casket, like those used for little children, 800 men in green uniforms filed to have a last look at their old friend. The next morning, Sergeant Major Jiggs was buried with military honors, his casket covered with the emblem of the Marine Corps and the silken colors, gold and scarlet. They buried him where he spent most of his life with the Marines, on the field of athletics. A simple little mound marks the grave, but soon there will be erected a flitting monument to one of the greatest mascots that ever lived. Members of the Marine Corps have started a campaign to raise funds with which to purchase a headstone for Sergeant Major Jiggs, their friend and companion, now sleeping quietly in the bivouac of the dead. Sentenced to marry a girl with bobbed hair. Member of Improvement Association is defendant in mock trial, with jury of 6 women. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, February 11th, 1925. To bob or not to bob? That isn't a question at all. At least the subject of bobbed hair wasn't much of a question last night at a meeting of the Carondelet Improvement Association, in which one of its members was tried before a mock court on a charge of saying, "Women have no right to bob their hair." The court sat in the Carondelet Branch Library, 6800 Michigan Avenue. It was all well for Lawrence McDaniel, counsel for the wretched defendant, to cry out, with mock tears welling up in his eyes, that women had usurped man's last stand when they invaded the barbershop. It was entertaining to hear Charles M. Hay, the prosecuting attorney, rise to an impassioned defense of bobbed hair, while Circuit Judge Piercy, on the bench, tried to screw his face up into a judicial frown and smile at the jury at the same time. But the women on the jury, 3 bobbed and 3 unbobbed, maintained their neutrality to the last. Their faces told the audience that bobbed hair wasn't a question at all, any more than short skirts, left turns, or how do you like your eggs. Each one on the jury had made up her mind on bobbed hair as on the other questions, but each was prepared to see justice in the views of the others. In other words, it didn't make a darned bit of difference to the jury whether bobbed hair was praised or damned by the men, many of them, most of them bald or becoming so, who presented the question. When counsel asked witnesses, "When will I get what you owe me?" or "What is your real name?" the jurors laughed with the rest of the court, and Judge Piercy's mortarboard hat, donned to give solemnity to the occasion, took on a more rakish angle than before. But when counsel got into arguments touching directly on the subject of bobbed hair, the faces of the jury froze into impassivity, and they stared into the middle distance until counsel got off the subject again. Albert J. Michel of 7128 South Broadway, the defendant, stopped most of the verbal shots of counsel with various parts of his anatomy, and was under fire so constantly that one resolved never, no never, to be a defendant in such a vital case. The verdict was probably commensurate with his offense. The jury ordered that the defendant, a more or less confirmed bachelor, marry a bobbed-haired girl within 60 days. Sinclair Lewis's Hornet's Nest. The Literary Digest, May 29, 1926. Sinclair Lewis's defiance of God caused a mere ripple beside the tidal wave of comment over his renunciation of the Pulitzer Prize. God still remains more or less secure, but the prize is compelled to justify itself. Mr. Lewis also has to abide under an imputation of an underlying motive. He spurns the Pulitzer $1,000 and gets many $1,000s worth of advertising, says the Syracuse Post-Standard. It is an oft-repeated jibe, and may do an injustice to the author of what Mr. Mencken calls in the Baltimore Sun, a gallant and excellent gesture. As almost everybody now knows, Mr. Lewis, through his publishers, told the world that he wouldn't accept the Pulitzer Prize for various reasons. First, he dislikes any prize going to a book best representing the wholesome atmosphere of American life and the highest standards of manners and manhood. Implicitly denying that his book presents anything of the kind, he claims that such a definition limits the scope of the award, and tends to put a compulsion on writers to become safe, polite, obedient, and sterile. He foresees that such standards would mean that the appraisal of novels would be made not according to their literary merit, but in obedience to whatever code of good form may chance to be popular at the moment. The press commenting on his letter specialize on 2 points: Mr. Lewis in particular, and novelists in general seduced by the lure of a prize. Editorial writers have not missed the chance to poke a little fun at the protester. More than one suggest that some chagrin appears that Main Street and Babbitt did not earlier attract the attention of the committee. The Minneapolis Tribune presents this view. It would seem that Mr. Lewis has gone in for a rather far-fetched arraignment of the Pulitzer Prizes. The feeling will be general that, to put it mildly, his manners were not of the best. The suspicion will also be enunciated that he has nursed a pique against the Pulitzer Prize judges for having ignored his Main Street and Babbitt. In many quarters, it will be felt that he is now turning his back on the Pulitzer Prize judges because twice before they turned their back on him. At any rate, the appearances being what they are, he might more gracefully have taken the prize and concealed his thoughts. The Pulitzer Prizes perhaps do American letters no particular good, but for all that, they certainly represent no menace either. Essentially a somewhat futile institution, the Pulitzer Prize Award is dignified too much when Mr. Lewis proceeds to wax so spectacular and melodramatic about it. From the volume of newspaper comments on Mr. Lewis's gesture, the suggestion arises that here is a chance to award another prize. Who has reacted most humorously to Mr. Lewis's seriousness? If it should fall to us to make the award, we should light upon the Philadelphia Record. Merely to look a gift horse in the mouth may satisfy the ordinary mind suspicious of the creature's value. Measures far more robust are adopted by one of our literary modernists. He hits the devoted animal a smash in the jaw and executes around the shivering equine form a war dance of sardonic repudiation. Well, this is Boy Week, so why shouldn't the spirit of flaming youth express itself in thumbing its nose at literary distinction as well as in playing marbles and the harmonica? And even those who smile at his antics must admit that Mr. Sinclair Lewis, for the assault is perpetrated by none other than the creator of George F. Babbitt, packs, as the saying is, a mean wallop. By the judgment of the committee, the Pulitzer Prize for the best novel of the year was awarded a few days ago to Mr. Lewis's Aerosmith. Doubtless, the judges made the selection in all sincerity, and probably with a subtle sense that they exhibited proper courage and enlightenment in thus honoring an independent and ruthless satirist. But swift and devastating was the rejoinder of the infuriated author. It was not enough that he should reject the proffered accolade. He must spurn it with contumelious scorn and denounce it as an agency of prostitution. All prizes, he wrote, are dangerous, for the aspirants labor not for excellence, but for alien rewards, and timorously court the prejudices of those distributing the largesse. Not for his proud hands are such bestowals. The only rewards he finds tolerable are popularity and royalties, untainted by endorsement from any self-appointed critics. Without accepting Mr. Lewis's conception of good manners or conceding that the Pulitzer verdict is inherently vicious, it may be said that his rejection exhibits vigor of mind and spirit. He has a perfect right to express his personal aversion to accepting the judgment. Not quite so happy is his assumption that any writer who does accept such a tribute thereby debases his profession and expresses a paltry subservience to arbitrary authority for the sake of gain. Men and women not Mr. Lewis's inferiors in literary talents or sublimity of soul have endured the supposititious affront without any sacrifice of honor, dignity, or prestige. What he professes to fear is that the authority of the committee may become a sanctified tradition, and the body a tribunal to doubt which would be deemed blasphemy. Any tradition being to minds like his something infamous, and resort to blasphemy a cherished right, he naturally makes grievous outcry against such possibilities. But we think his passionate fears for literary freedom are a little neurasthenic. The recipients of the Pulitzer Awards have been, for the most part, persons of unquestioned and even ostentatious candor of utterance. The very fact that his latest work was chosen might reasonably have quelled the flutterings of suspicion in his breast. The decision showed anything but a sinister pandering to moral sentiment and Victorian conventions. But his outstanding protest is that the Pulitzer Award is peculiarly objectionable because of its terms. With undisguised scorn, he quotes the requirement that the prize novel shall be one presenting the wholesome atmosphere of American life and the highest standards of American manners and manhood. To be branded as a purveyor of wholesome atmosphere and high standards of manners and manhood, could there be a more exasperating affront to the Sinclair Lewises of today? One cannot but sympathize with his agonizing resentment against being associated with themes so unworthy of the exercise of literary genius. Let those who will be corrupted by prizes which he conceives to be rewards for being safe, polite, obedient, and sterile. But let no one presume to imply that he is, or ever will be, anything but dangerous, impudent, rebellious, and fecund in devices for shocking the Philistines. Woof woof, isn't he the desperate fellow? Incidentally, isn't it pleasant to know that by rejecting the $1,000 prize, Mr. Lewis will garner about $42,685 worth of publicity, and that such a thrifty idea never could have entered his idealistic mind? Speaking a little further of the hazards to American literature from writers writing for prizes and not for their own soul's sake, it is absurd, says the Providence News, to think that any able author is deliberately writing in order to win the Pulitzer Prize. The game would not be worth the candle. The great danger to an author's sincerity of opinion and devotion to his art, says the Columbus Evening Dispatch, does not lie in prizes of this nature, which are few in number and comparatively small. The peril lies rather in the far greater financial reward to be won by making a successful appeal to passing phases of a sensation-loving literary market. And the writers most likely to be tempted to yield to that peril are hardly those who would try, regardless of sincerity, to win $1,000 by the best portrayal of the wholesome atmosphere of American life and the highest standard of American manners and manhood. Agnes Repplier, Zona Gale, Carl Van Doren, and some others are quoted in approval of Mr. Lewis's course. The Winston-Salem Journal writes, "Does Lewis not sound a note of warning when he declares that the administrators of the prize may become a Supreme Court, a college of cardinals, so rooted and so sacred that to challenge them will be to commit blasphemy? He will do his part in preventing such an arbitrary authority being established by ignoring the award that comes to him." The Eternal Mucker. The Outlook, October 18th, 1922. The baseball series for the World's Championship between the winners in the National and American Leagues has ended in a fashion unexpected by dopesters, both professional and amateur. Most of the wise gentlemen who edit the sporting columns of newspapers had predicted a victory for the New York Yankees. The triumph, however, perched upon the banners of the New York Giants in 4 straight games. It is a hard world, particularly for those who have to depend for a living largely upon their records as prophets. The victory of the Giants was unexpected, but there was another feature of the series which, we are sad to say, was unforeseen, but which could readily be expected from the average American baseball crowd. The second game of the series was called on account of darkness, when the score was tied in the 10th inning. Those who attended the game differ as to the necessity for this act. Christy Mathewson, whose record for good sportsmanship and fairness cannot be questioned, states that the umpires were correct in their judgment. The howling fans, however, believed otherwise. With the intelligence usually displayed by a mob, they proceeded to vent their wrath upon Judge Landis and his wife. Judge Landis, who resigned an honorable position on the bench to become the arbiter of baseball ethics, had a signal exhibition of the ethics of baseball fans when he attempted to leave the grounds at the conclusion of the game. There seems to have been no one present who was quite fool enough to hurl the traditional pop bottle at Judge Landis's head, but the fans apparently stopped short of little in the way of verbal missiles. The American likes to consider himself a good sportsman. He has not earned this title by his acts on the bleachers surrounding American diamonds. The criticism that the game was called to ensure the necessity of additional lucrative contests has been silenced by the gift of the receipts of the game to charities. Half of them ought to have gone to a society for the suppression of the eternal mucker. Girl, 12, is hugger's victim. The Washington Times, November 9th, 1925. Renewed efforts were made today by the police to apprehend the mysterious bicyclist who, for more than 2 weeks, has been spreading terror in his wake by jumping from his wheel and grabbing young girls around the legs. The fourth attack of Jack the Hugger was made on little Ruth Gwynn, 12 years old, of 111 C Street Northeast, shortly after dark last night. The screams of the girl, accompanied by a couple of lusty kicks on his shins, scared the man away before he could be captured. Ruth was returning from a picture show to her home and had reached a point nearly to 12th Street on D when she was called to by a man seated on a bicycle, with one foot resting on the curb. The man asked her how he could get to 1305 F Street, and as she came up to him to give the directions, he leaped from his bicycle and grabbed her. According to the girl's story, he seized her around the waist and made an indecent remark. She kicked him on the shin and screamed with fright. He released her, and she fled to her home. She turned around once in her flight and saw the man ride away out 12th Street. The girl told her parents of the affair on her arrival home, and her father, Homer Gwynn, started out in quest of the hugger. A search of the vicinity proving fruitless, he returned home and took his daughter to the 9th Precinct Station to report the matter. Lieutenant O.T. Davis organized a search for the man. Police at the precinct this morning signified intention to continue the search. Helen Smith, 15, a cousin, living at 1120 C Street Northwest, had accompanied Miss Gwynn to the picture show, and had been with her until just before the attack, when she had gone ahead to her home. The attack took place at about 7:45 in the evening, and the manner of procedure was similar to that of other attacks supposed to have been made by the same man, who has been terrorizing young girls of the Northeast section for several days past. Ruth described him as wearing a dark suit and blue serge cap, of about 5 feet 8 inches in height and of a size weighing about 140 pounds. His bicycle was without light of any kind. All descriptions furnished the police of the mysterious attacker are exactly alike. In all cases, the attacker has ridden his lightless bicycle up to the curb and leaped at his victims, embracing them and uttering indecent remarks. Mrs. Elizabeth Wright, living at the Roland Apartments, was attacked by the hugger last Wednesday night when she was walking on Maryland Avenue, near 3rd Street Northeast. She is reported completely recovered from the shock she sustained, which resulted in her being confined to bed for a time. Gladys Burrs, 15, of 435 10th Street Northeast, and Ida Willard, 15, of 433 10th Street Northeast, are other victims of the hugging attacks. The attacks on these two were made on D Street, near 11th, on a night early last week, when the man, dismounting from his bicycle, leaped on them. Hugger held on nurse's charge. The Washington Times, November 17, 1925. Alexandria, Virginia, November 17th. Frank Williams, colored, alleged by the police to be Jack the Hugger, was arrested last night on the complaint of a nurse at the Alexandria Hospital, whose name was not divulged by the officials. Williams was sent to the state penitentiary for 2 years on similar charges, and has only recently been released. He will be given a hearing in police court. In his last appearance here, Williams was charged with accosting 3 white women in various parts of the city. The Hex Murder. The Outlook, January 23, 1929. York County, Pennsylvania is not the only community in which there are people who are pathetically superstitious and mentally arrested, but it happens to have furnished a murder trial that should make every community think of its duty to those in it who are mentally starved or stunted, and incidentally of its own further protection. A family in York County believed that it was bewitched, or in the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect, hexed. Misfortune followed misfortune. As the mother of the family testified, "It got so I didn't care if my children got anything to eat or anything else. Our chickens got away, and something was done to our cattle." To remove the spell, a powwow doctor named Blymeyer, with 2 companions, one a member of this family, another a boy of 14, went to the home of the alleged sorcerer or hexer to get a tuft of his hair to bury in the earth as a cure of the family's ills. In resisting the attempt to get his hair, the alleged sorcerer, Raymeyer, was killed. All 3 implicated in the killing were tried, found guilty, and sentenced to imprisonment. During the trial, a most extraordinary mental condition among the people involved was revealed. For the cure of illness or for the removal of misfortune of any kind, these people depended upon incantations, which included formulas in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, upon cryptic signs, and upon symbolic actions. Pleas of insanity were rejected. As long as this powwow doctor and the 2 boys who were with him are imprisoned, they will no longer be a menace to their neighbors. But their imprisonment does not solve the problem which ignorance, penury, and fear have created. Perhaps the verdict may impress upon a few of these people the fact that there are other people in the world who do not accept hexing with incidental murder as a cure. This murder occurred in a community provided with public schools and with other means of education and information. Evidently, those means are not sufficient to protect the community against the hazards caused by ignorance and fear. The trial itself was evidently conducted with intelligence. The army of reporters and sob sisters, which has helped to make such trials as the Hall Mills case in New Jersey and the Snyder case in New York a reproach to American methods of administering justice, was excluded from the York County Courthouse. The New York World, whose reporter was among those excluded, editorially commends York County for its conduct of the case. But the trial itself will become significant in proportion as it makes all communities realize the importance of public education, and of such measures as will provide custody for those whose minds are incapable of development. With the conviction and imprisonment of the murderers, the case is not closed. Scenes of devastation in the Holy Land, where an earthquake killed 670 persons. The Literary Digest, August 6, 1927. Just 100 years ago, an earthquake devastated Palestine and eastern Egypt, killing some 4,000 persons. On July 11, 1927, the Holy Land was rocked again by a quake that was felt from Syria on the north to Egypt on the south, but proved most destructive to life and property in Palestine and in Transjordania, the territory under British mandate east of the Palestine border. Jerusalem correspondents of American newspapers placed the number of killed at 670, and the injured at approximately 3,000. The property damage was estimated on July 14th, 3 days after the quake, at $2 million. The British government's headquarters was damaged to the extent of $150,000, it is said. The Red Cross and other private and governmental agencies rushed supplies and medicines by airplane from the nearest depots immediately after the shocks. The rescuers found that the modern towns had suffered little compared with the primitive Arab villages, where the crude mud huts were unable to withstand the tremors. Jericho, with its new hotel, its public buildings, monasteries, and convents, was razed. Ramla and Lydda, ancient towns about 12 miles from Jaffa, were heavy sufferers. Amman and Es-Salt were practically laid waste. In Nablus, scarcely a house in the old part of the town escaped, we are told. Like a war-shelled town, the buildings crumbled. Every house in Jerusalem is said to have felt the force of the earthquake, which so damaged the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as to make it unsafe. Mount Etna's River of Molten Lava. The Literary Digest, December 1st, 1928. One of Mount Etna's worst eruptions began the first week in November, sending down rivers of fuming, semi-liquid volcanic matter that left several thriving Sicilian cities virtually buried. Stone houses, bridges, railway stations, and the railway tracks themselves were covered by streams of molten lava. To quote from the dispatches of Arnaldo Cortese, Roman correspondent of the New York Times, Mount Etna has laid fiery hands on Mascali and Annunziata, destroying them both almost completely. It is now sending a stream of fiery liquid toward Giare, a city of 25,000. These molten rivers are cutting communications, isolating the whole zone from the outside world, and snapping power lines, plunging the entire region in darkness. They are also cutting off the water supply from these cities. Slowly but inexorably, the lava advances. One house after another yields to its terrific thrust. The air in the town of Mascali is as hot as a furnace. The next day, Mr. Cortese wrote, "Where Mascali, a city of 10,000 people, flourished yesterday, there is today a molten waste. Only a few heaps of charred wreckage remain. High up on the slope, the cemetery, untouched, its marble tombstones showing white through the cinder-laden air, seems to be mourning the death that has overtaken the city below. The belfry of Mascali's main church was the last thing to be submerged in a river of fire. Just before it disappeared, it rocked with the lava's mighty force, and its bells rang mournfully, tolling without a bellman a death knell for this Sicilian town." England's visitation of blizzard and flood. The Literary Digest, January 28, 1928. The worst Christmas storm in England's history since 1886, and the first white Christmas the southern part of the country has known in 21 years, was followed by floods that cost several lives and millions of dollars. Starvation threatened people in many of the villages that were isolated by the storm. Snowdrifts are recorded as high as 20 feet. Many roads were impassable, and passengers in an express train were stranded all night when it ran into a drift. The heavy floods which did such great damage in London and its environs were said to have been caused by abnormal tides flowing in from the North Sea to meet floodwaters coming down from the upper Thames. There is no accurate estimate of the damage available, though it is known to be enormous, says the Montreal Daily Star. And while the loss of life is more deplorable, it would have been infinitely heavier but for the splendid work of the police, of firemen, and of volunteers drawn from all classes of the community, with the Londoners' typical reaction to crises. One of the bright spots in a record of otherwise ghastly gloom, this newspaper adds, is the self-sacrificing manner in which workers labored incessantly to fight the encroachments of the floodwaters of Old Father Thames. Probably the most memorable thing of all about the Great Christmas Storm of 1927, says the Manchester Guardian, is the great dislocation of the shorter channel passages. On both sides of the channel, would-be passengers appear to have been piled up rather as the snowdrifts have been piled up in Kent. At one time, there were 1,500 passengers waiting at Boulogne to go to England. Meanwhile, this newspaper calls attention to the fact that those whose experience was confined, for instance, to Manchester and its immediate district, experienced nothing after Christmas Day but bright sunshine and a cold wind, so that their holidays left behind no particular reason for complaints. But it goes on to say, the news and pictures of great floods in the Thames Valley, of deep and impassable snowdrifts in Kent, the very garden of England, of Hampshire villages cut off from the world for 2 days at a time, or the story of the winter sports enthusiast who skied from Tring to Dunstable along the Chilterns, these things tell their tale of a very different Christmas. Of course, the higher slopes of the Pennines have also received their share of the visitation, but the lower regions of the Northwest have escaped with wonderful and impressive lightness. When Spring Floods Deluge the Southland. The Literary Digest, March 30th, 1929. Heavy March rains and spring thaws caused destructive floods this year in many sections, including the New England states, Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Georgia, and Florida. But the most serious situation developed in southeastern Alabama, where the Chattahoochee and its tributaries overflowed their banks and inundated hundreds of square miles, marooning many persons on housetops and in trees, and making refugees of thousands of others. While few lives seem to have been lost, the destruction of property was heavy, and the receding waters left in their wake poverty and disease. Such recurring disasters, we are reminded by the press, emphasize the fact that flood control is a national rather than a local problem. Camera records of Fall River's most disastrous fire. The Literary Digest, February 18th, 1928. The worst fire in the city's history broke out in the business district of Fall River, Massachusetts on the evening of February 2nd. Before it was brought under control with the assistance of firemen from nearly a dozen neighboring towns and cities, it had gnawed its way through 20 blocks and destroyed property whose estimated value ranges from $7,500,000 to $12,200,000. Of the 250 persons reported injured, 200 were firemen. Says a writer in the Providence Journal, "From across the Taunton River, Fall River looked like a forest fire roaring up a mountainside. A northwest wind was blowing away from the waterfront, and the streets were like giant chimneys that sucked up an increasing draft. High above the city, a grayish cloud of smoke reflected the raging furnace and made a crimson mantle that was visible for a radius of 20 miles. The reflection across the water was so great that one could easily read a newspaper by its glow." The Kanto Earthquake. The Literary Digest, September 29th and October 13th, 1923. What the earthquake did to one flourishing Japanese village. This is the little seashore resort village of Ito as it looked when the first photographer reached it after the earthquake of September 1st. Multiply this in your mind by 1,000 and you have an approximate idea of the conditions in the great cities of Tokyo and Yokohama. Homeless, distracted refugees. Thousands like them sought safety along all the roads and paths in the earthquake-shattered district on September 1st. This is part of a group walking along a railroad track toward Tokyo, unaware that the capital had been practically wiped out. Quake chasms in the highway. It tells better than words what an earthquake does to the solid ground. This is the surface of the main highway, a modern motor road between Tokyo and Yokohama. Earthquake-proof buildings seem practical, but how about earthquake-proof roads? Quake-proof sleeping quarters. Refugees whose homes have been wrecked sleeping in the big iron pipes of the water main at Numazu, near Yokohama. Ruins of the Fuji cotton mill, where 500 women workers were reported killed. The Yokohama waterfront as it appeared a few minutes after the first shocks. Photograph taken from the Canadian Pacific steamer Empress of Australia, just showing at the right, crowded with refugees. On the left, persons can be seen scrambling to safety down the fallen roof of a pier shed, while in the middle distance, several tugs are busily picking up survivors. In the distance are the faint outlines of the city, hazy under its pall of smoke from the burning buildings. The St. Francis Dam. The Literary Digest, March 24th, 1928. Hundreds of people were killed, towns and villages in the Santa Clara River Valley devastated, 1,000 ranch homes destroyed, 10 important bridges washed away, and 20 lineal miles of valuable orchard lands buried under several feet of mud and silt, say Associated Press and other dispatches, when the Great St. Francis Dam, spanning San Francisco Canyon and impounding a part of the Los Angeles water supply, collapsed soon after midnight on March 13th and loosed a 78-foot wall of water on the valley's sleeping inhabitants. Caught in the swirling flood, ranch houses were crushed like eggshells or tossed about like corks on the crest of the tremendous wave, and their inhabitants, in most cases, carried to their doom. The Los Angeles municipal powerhouse a few miles below the dam was completely destroyed, and the peaceful canyon turned into a cemetery as the rushing waters engulfed the residents and their livestock. Everything was swept away, and over the whole of the valley a deep layer of yellowish silt was deposited. Under this, Ventura County officials fear lie scores of dead. The property damage has been estimated at from $15 million to $30 million. State and county officials are at a loss to account for the sudden collapse of the St. Francis Dam, although some are said to admit that slight earth tremors that have occurred recently in Southern California may have been a contributing cause to the break. 7 separate and independent investigations were started the day following the disaster. Meanwhile, Red Cross workers and hundreds of volunteer riders braving the dangerous quicksands of the Santa Clara, aided by airplanes, are searching the devastated valley and aiding the destitute. The Miami Hurricane. The Literary Digest, October 2nd and 9th, 1926. The hurricane at its height. A photograph taken on Miami Beach while the gale was blowing at the rate of 100 miles an hour. When the storm had passed. This picture shows a steel frame building in Miami, apparently uninjured by the storm, which carried boats from Biscayne Bay a quarter of a mile inland and dropped them in one of the city's main streets. What happened to frame buildings in Miami? An innocent among the ruins. Many young lives were lost in the great storm, but this child was among those spared by a seeming miracle. The picture shows a part of what is left of the city of Dania, Florida, practically demolished by the hurricane. Desolation in its wildest aspect. Laying low the tropic palm trees of Miami Beach, as shown here, the terrific wind also piled up the ocean, which rose near these trees to a point 4 blocks inshore. Lifted bodily out of its element. This United States government craft was one of the many vessels to be cast ashore when the hurricane hit the crowded harbor of Miami. Blown askew like an autumn leaf. The terrific force of the wind is demonstrated by the way it played with parked automobiles. Here is one that was flattened up against the side of a building. The New England Flood. The Literary Digest, November 19th, 1927. After a brief period of almost tropical warmth, western New England, as told in the news dispatches, was visited on November 3rd by a deluge of torrential rain, caused apparently by the advance of a storm bank of cold air from the west that met a warmer eastern storm over Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. The many hill streams, already higher than usual from autumn rains, began to rise rapidly. By the next morning, New England found itself without warning in the grip of a flood that soon assumed unparalleled proportions. There was no withstanding the walls of raging foam that swept down the valleys. Bridges collapsed before the onrushing waters, swollen at various points by bursting dams. Houses were swept away bodily or left standing 2/3 deep in water. Their occupants succeeded in most cases in escaping to places of safety, but the toll of lives was heavy. Latest reports placed the dead at 132 and the homeless at 7,500 or more. The loss of life was nearly all in Vermont, 12 deaths occurring in Massachusetts, 4 in New Hampshire, and 2 in Maine. Cattle and sheep at pasture or in barns, together with other domestic animals, are reported drowned by thousands. Electric light and power, we learn, failed in many towns and villages. Industry came to a standstill, not a wheel turning over a wide area. Schools were closed. Railroad traffic was disrupted and in many cases stopped altogether. Autos were everywhere abandoned along the highways as the waters overtook them. Landslides swept away roads and railroad tracks. Telephone and telegraph service was crippled, many towns being isolated entirely. The money lost to property and industry runs to many millions, that in Rutland, Vermont being estimated at $5 million, with a possible $2 million for Montpelier, capital of the state. Towns in the Winooski Valley have been virtually wiped out. Connecticut later suffered greatly as the floodwaters swept down to the sea. Snow and bitter cold added their terrors to the situation and impeded the work of relief, which is being conducted with thoroughness and efficiency. The Red Cross and the Salvation Army have labored splendidly, and the state troopers have kept down lawlessness. Many tales of heroism shine out against the dark background of tragedy, such as that of Esther McCormick, who, like another Paul Revere, drove about the town of Beckett in the darkness to warn those without telephones of the impending bursting of the dam above them, while her father notified the rest over the wire. The St. Louis Tornado. The Literary Digest, October 15, 1927. Front of apartment house blown out by pressure from within, leaving the occupants unharmed. School partly wrecked while in session, from which all the children were led in safety. Damaged hospital, none of whose 63 patients was hurt. Ruins of garage and bakery, from beneath which a young girl was taken unscratched after having been blown through a wall. A fair sample of conditions in the wrecked district. This photograph was taken on Olive Street shortly after the storm went by, and just as streetcars and autos began to venture about once more. Stupid as a Policeman. Time, March 12, 1928. The National Crime Commission, to which national figures volunteer their energy, intelligence, and time, last week published a report by Mr. Frank Orrin Loden's committee. Written by Commissioner Lewis Newton Robinson, experienced professor of economics and criminology, this report set forth as prime cause of crime's prevalence in the U.S. the lack of average intelligence in the police force, particularly in the supervisory branches. The unfortunate police force of Cleveland, Ohio, was singled out as a prime example. An Army intelligence test given in Cleveland had revealed 3% of the patrolmen possessed Class A mentality, as against 9% of the privates in the U.S. Army. Not a single detective possessed Class A mentality. 4% of the detectives were Class B. 25% of the detectives were Class C. 25% of the detectives were of markedly inferior mentality. 33% of the patrolmen had average intelligence. 25% of the patrolmen were morons. Cleveland came off better in a table of percentages of arrests made in murder and manslaughter cases. The percentages are so low that one no longer wonders why so many individuals turn to crime. It would appear to be about the safest business in which one could engage. Robbery in Buffalo, for example, must be a particularly lucrative calling. As arrests are made in only 3% of the cases, the number who are finally convicted is necessarily so small that the luckless individual who is occasionally caught and convicted must attribute his misfortune to an act of God, as he would in case of disastrous storm, shipwreck, or earthquake. Police Chief Girk of Baltimore protested that such figures mean nothing. He said, "A couple of weeks ago, we arrested a man who admitted committing 100 burglaries. His pal admitted 50. 2 warrants were issued against each. Therefore, on the record, it would appear that 98 burglaries were unsolved in the case of the first man, and 48 in the case of the second." From police stupidity, the report proceeded to flay lax prosecutors, loose bail systems, unreliable juries. It recommended, as a model for other cities, Detroit's Consolidated Criminal Court. Deporting Japanese in California. The Literary Digest, August 13th, 1921. Turlockian boneheads is the opprobrious epithet which the Berkeley Times hurls at itinerant workers and residents of Turlock, California, who deported by moonlight 50 or 60 Japanese melon pickers and conveyed them by motor trucks to neighboring towns. "From such little incidents, greater troubles grow," remarks the Buffalo commercial. While the New York Times reminds us that the Turlock case is particularly embarrassing to the federal government at this time because of Japan's recent acceptance of the invitation to the conference to discuss Pacific questions and disarmament. What the Japanese Consul General at San Francisco terms the most deplorable affair of its kind in California since he has been in office was caused, say California papers, by the apparent willingness of Japanese to pick melons for 16 cents a crate, whereas white men had been receiving 25 cents, the union rate. By sending a few score Japanese workers to the next town in motor trucks, argued the white men, the importation of more Japanese laborers would be prevented. Accordingly, this was done not alone by itinerant pickers, say California dispatches, but by a mob 60% of which consisted of Turlockians. The method used by the mob, we are told, was to arouse the intended victim, give him a certain time in which to dress and collect his belongings, then order him into the motor truck that was to take him away. The result was that the next day saw a general exodus of Japanese, although Japanese landholders, who were not disturbed by the mob, remained. Tokyo papers noted this deportation from the fruit ranches and characterized it as barbarous, uncivilized, and a disgrace to America, in the words of the Hochi Shimbun. In fact, the American government is no better than the Russian government if it cannot be held to responsibility for this outrage, says the Yorozu Choho. And the Philadelphia Record reminds us that when some of our people are maltreated in Mexico or Turkey or China, there is a loud demand that the Navy should be sent thither. No matter how we feel about the Japanese here in California, we cannot or should not forget that we as individuals are not the vested authority of the state, the Berkeley Times further declares. As Governor Stevens states, anti-Japanese demonstrations are not sanctioned by the better citizenship. Officers and order-loving citizens will make a grave mistake if another such occurrence is permitted. California is the leader among the states in the movement that is now nationwide for the complete cessation of immigration to America of all peoples inalienable to citizenship. Every happening such as that at Turlock materially injures our cause and sets us back tremendously. The people of California will insist upon the due observance of the rights of the Japanese and other aliens now resident in California. Practically all the California papers which we have seen are with the governor in his desire for law and order. Japanese who are lawfully in this state are entitled to every protection with which the state and nation can surround them, maintains the San Francisco Chronicle. While the Oakland Tribune deplores the regrettable occurrences at Turlock and pleads that the good name of California be preserved. Mob action must not be tolerated, no matter who are the victims, agrees the Fresno Republican, which goes on. The very fact that we, as a measure of public policy, object to more Japanese coming to America and object to Japanese acquiring a hold on land titles should make us the more careful to assure to Japanese in the United States the peaceful right of residence, undisturbed by noisy clamor. Race antipathy may, in an orderly way, become the basis for certain legislation. It must not become provocative of mob violence. But the Sacramento Bee asserts that the Japanese have no one to blame but themselves for the disregard in which they are held in California, although it deplores the use of force by mobs in any case. And the reason the Japanese are unpopular, declares this paper, is that they insist on building in this state an empire of their own. Nevertheless, it adds, some good may come out of evil in the present clashes between Americans and Japanese, if it brings our national government to a realization that immediate action is necessary to stop completely and forever any further immigration of laborers from Japan, as well as to ensure by constitutional amendment that the children of those now here shall not become citizens through the mere accident of birth. Albany's Ousted Socialists. The Literary Digest, January 24th, 1920. Emphatic protest and almost universal condemnation are launched by Republican, Democratic, and Socialist newspapers alike at the unprecedented action of the New York Assembly in summarily suspending the 5 duly elected Socialist members of that body. Not only does this country appear to be interested in the outcome of the struggle, but the capitals of Europe are concerned over the ultimate fate of New York's socialist legislators. George Bernard Shaw, whose utterances are, as usual, crisp and interesting, believes that the Americans are savages still, that the primitive communities prosecute opinion as a matter of course. It is high time for the Mayflower to fit out for sea again, concludes GBS, according to a cabled dispatch to the New York World. The unseating process, it seems, was initiated by the Speaker of the House immediately after the formalities of organizing for the session of 1920 were completed. The 5 Socialist members, Claysons, Orr, Solomon, Waldman, and DeWitt, were called before Speaker Sweet and subjected to a severe arraignment because of their membership in the Socialist Party, much to their surprise and that of their Democratic and Republican colleagues. Party leaders had not been taken into the confidence of the Speaker, and when that gentleman virtually accused the 5 Socialists of seeking seats in the Assembly after having been elected on a platform that is absolutely inimical to the best interests of the state of New York and the United States, many members, according to one party leader, assumed that the Speaker possessed definite evidence of the Socialist members' unfitness for office, and voted 140 to 6 for their suspension, until their fitness could be passed upon by the Judiciary Committee of the Assembly. A few days later, the Assembly voted 71 to 33 for the trial of the suspended Socialists. 41 members either were absent or did not answer the roll call. The action which resulted in the temporary downfall of the Socialist members of the Assembly came at the conclusion of the Speaker's lecture, in which he promised the suspended members a chance to appear before an Assembly tribunal to prove their right to a seat in the Assembly. After considerable cheering, Republican floor leader Adler presented the resolution for suspension of the Assemblymen. Charging that the Socialist Party had endorsed the principles of the Communist International of Moscow, that each Socialist member had agreed to be guided by the Constitution and platform of the party, that the Socialist Party had urged its members to refrain from taking part in the war or in the making of munitions, the resolution went on to say, whereas Lewis Waldman, August Claysons, Samuel A. DeWitt, Samuel Orr, and Charles Solomon are members of the Socialist Party of America, and whereas the said Socialist Party did at its official party convention, held in the city of Chicago, Illinois, in the month of August 1919, declare its adherence and solidarity with the revolutionary forces of Soviet Russia, and did pledge itself and its members to the furtherance of the international socialist revolution. And whereas instructions may be given by an executive committee made up in whole or in part of alien or alien enemies, owing allegiance to governments or organizations inimical to the interests of the United States and the people of the state of New York. Whereas the said members of the Socialist Party of America, having been elected upon the platform of the Socialist Party of America, have thereby subscribed to its principles and its aims and purposes against the organized government of the United States and the state of New York, and have been actively associated with and connected with an organization convicted of a violation of the Espionage Act of the United States. Therefore be it resolved that the said Lewis Waldman, August Claessens, Samuel A. DeWitt, Samuel Orr, and Charles Solomon, members of the Socialist Party, be and they hereby are denied seats in this assembly pending the determination of their qualification and eligibility to their respective seats. Pithy socialist comment and criticism are indulged in by the Schenectady Citizen, which declares that taxation without representation is still tyranny, just as it was in 1776, and thus calls our attention to the fact that approximately 50,000 constituents of the Socialist Assemblymen are now unrepresented in one branch of the legislature. The Socialists refuse to be stamped into lawlessness, and still have faith in the ballot, the Citizen assures us, and regrets that representative government in New York State was killed by the action at Albany. Even the Tsar of Russia in his palmiest days, it goes on, permitted socialists to sit in the Duma. Well in the forefront of critics of the Speaker's arbitrary action is former Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. His open letter, the New York Tribune says, so completely covers the issue raised at Albany that little remains for others to say. The utterance, continues the Tribune, is one that rises to the dignity of a state paper to guide the future. Part of the letter follows. I deeply regret the action of the Assembly in suspending 5 members of the Socialist Party who have been duly elected. It is not, as I view it, in accordance with the spirit of our institutions, but on the contrary, it is absolutely opposed to the fundamental principles of our government for a majority to undertake to deny representation to a minority through its representatives elected by ballots lawfully cast. I understand that the action is not directed against these 5 elected members as individuals, but that the proceeding is virtually an attempt to indict a political party and to deny it representation in the legislature. That is not, in my judgment, American government. Are socialists, unconvicted of crime, to be denied the ballot? If their candidates are elected and are men against whom, as individuals, charges of disqualifying offenses cannot be laid, are they not entitled to their seats? Why should these privileges be denied to representatives of the Socialist Party? Is it not clear that the government cannot be saved at the cost of its own principles? I have sufficient confidence in our institutions to believe that they will survive all the onslaughts of discussion and political controversy. But democracy cannot be preserved if representation is denied. Apart from the matter of principle, the procedure is futile. To shut out the duly elected representatives of the socialists is merely to multiply socialists by the 1,000. Instead of protecting us from revolution, it will do more to encourage the spirit of revolution and to strengthen the advocates of violence than any conceivable propaganda could accomplish. Concurring in the views of ex-Governor Hughes are dozens of jurists, lawyers, ministers, senators, and assemblymen of New York who declare that the action taken at Albany was hasty, politically unwise, extraordinary, dangerous, legally unjust, unwarranted, reactionary, biased, the result of prejudice, and unfair. Other legislators who set forth their views in the New York World are for waiting for the decision of the Judiciary Committee before rendering a decision. Some are for barring the socialist members if they are guilty, and still others would bar socialists merely because they are members of the party. The majority of public opinion, however, seems to be in favor of giving the suspended members a hearing. For instance, we are informed by the New York Tribune that a protest movement against the action of the legislature is developing among the most prominent clergymen of the city. These gentlemen have circulated a statement protesting against this proposed infringement of representative popular government as intolerable. A resolution of the Bar Association of New York, signed by a score or more of lawyers and jurists of international reputation, protests against the action of the Albany legislators. The Albany Knickerbocker Press reminds us that the Socialist Party is a political party under the laws of the state of New York, having the same standing in the eyes of the law as the Democratic and Republican parties. The Newark Evening News ascribes the action taken at Albany to present-day anti-red hysterics, and directs our attention to the fact that the British Labour Party, or Socialist Party, holds forth in Parliament, and says, "It would be just as wise for Parliament to expel the British Labour Party, bag and baggage, as it is for the New York legislature to suspend socialist members." Criticism hostile to socialists in general, and approval of the move made by the Assembly at Albany, however, comes from two Baltimore papers. The American avers that socialists do not belong under our system, not any more than a quintet of safe-breakers would belong in a convention of savings bank directors. While the News sees in the practically unanimous vote of the Assembly the desire of the country to proceed with firm purpose to stamp out disloyalty. In the same vein, the Lowell Courier-Citizen questions the advisability of permitting certain types of socialist agitator to sit in our legislative assemblages if we are to require, as we do, an oath of allegiance as the prerequisite for sitting. "So help me God," this newspaper asserts, is meaningless to most such. The New York Commercial believes that the case of Victor Berger and of the 5 socialist assemblymen are analogous. In the meantime, the Springfield Republican looks forward to interesting developments if the older parties should take a notion to get rid of each other by the Albany Assembly method. And where will it end? Shall we sometimes see Republicans excluding Democrats and Democrats excluding Republicans from our lawmaking bodies on the ground that the other party's principles are inimical to the best interests of the United States? Every party has always thought that of its rivals, but it is something new in America for parties to translate the idea into action. Picture brides coming from Japan to this country. Midweek Pictorial, August 5th, 1920. Considerable agitation has occurred in California on the subject of the so-called picture brides. And this has received an additional stimulus from the arrival recently at San Francisco of 40 more of this class on the liner Shinyo Maru. They were not allowed to land at the port, but were held at Angel Island, a detention depot that corresponds to Ellis Island in New York Harbor, while their status was investigated. The girls are fairly good-looking, according to Japanese standards, and there was no apparent irregularity in their passports. A congressional committee is now in session on the coast to inquire into the whole question of Japanese immigration and colonization, and it is by the members of that committee that the inquiry is being carried on. It has developed so far that scarcely any of the girls had ever seen the men whom they came here with intent to wed. They had, however, seen their photographs, and it was presumably this fact, combined with whatever inducement the would-be bridegrooms were able to offer, that decided their choice. It is evident that the system is capable of developing grave abuses, and diplomatic representations have been made by the United States government to Japan against the practice. It was understood that an agreement had been reached by the two governments that would prevent the sending of any more picture brides to this country. And for that reason, vehement protest was made when this last shipment arrived. Explanations were made that the reported agreement was not to go into force until after September 1st, when it is expected that any further immigration of that character will be prohibited. Cleaning up after the AEF. Popular Science Monthly, February 1920. All ready for the so-called $2 million airplane fire that aroused so much comment in this country. Rumor had it that the government simply gathered together most of the airplanes in France, removed the engines, and extravagantly burned what was left. But the government tells a different tale. Tires, hard and soft, smooth and non-skid, of all sizes and all styles, make up this pile. Those in front show plainly the rough usage to which they were put on the roads of France, which were literally shot to pieces. You would think, from the wheels and bodies strewn around, that the Germans had blown up a wagon factory, but such is not the case. In the general cleanup after our army left France, these wagons were classed as rubbish. Here you see some of the burning airplanes that were purposely fired in the general cleaning up process in France. The government says that only those parts that could not be sold or used were destroyed in this bonfire, and that the financial loss was not very great. There is a law that prevents the government from giving anything away. The belongings of soldiers' sons who died. Popular Science Monthly, February 1920. Most mothers were fortunate enough to have their soldier sons safely returned to them, but some paid the ultimate price of war. To these, the army is returning the personal effects of their boys. Checking up effects is often a heart-rending job. A bag of tobacco, a watch, and several pictures of his family were found in one boy's bag. His address was in his wallet, and so all his effects were sent home. Here is a typical collection of odds and ends taken from a ditty bag. Eyeglasses, rings, letters, wallet, a knife, a watch, and a hand grenade. The letters will enable the Bureau to find the boy's mother and to turn over to her her son's bag. Soldiers and sailors who are detailed to the work of opening trunks find it one of the hardest experiences to go through with. A complete record of every man who was killed is gradually being compiled by the Effects Bureau. Here you see several rows of boxes containing the completed records of many of the men. These trunks belonged to soldiers who died in France. The Effects Bureau in New York is trying to locate the families of these men. There are 4,000 unidentified trunks stored away in this room. What a Bullet Did in Japan. The Outlook, January 9th, 1924. The attempted assassination of the Japanese crown prince, who is Prince Regent, has stirred the empire hardly less than the earthquake of September 1st. It precipitated the fall of the Yamamoto government, which the earthquake itself had failed to dislodge. The cabinet was associated in the popular mind with toleration to communism, for Home Minister Goto, who is responsible for the maintenance of order, had invited Yofa to Japan in 1922, and a year ago had attempted to arrange with him the resumption of diplomatic relations with Moscow. So the shot directed by a communist or socialist against the Prince Regent nearly exposed members of the cabinet to the fury of mobs. But the assassin's bullet was only the occasion, not the cause, of the political change. Yamamoto's cabinet took office the day before the earthquake. It had no party backing. It was subject to suspicions inherited from the prior premiership of Admiral Yamamoto 10 years ago, when his ministry was involved in a naval graft scandal. And perhaps because of these suspicions, it suffered the humiliation of having its plans for the reconstruction of Tokyo rejected by the Diet the very day before the attempted assassination. It was also under the disadvantage of being a nonpartisan or intermediary government, at a time when politicians outside the circle of the elder statesmen were uniting in the belief that no ministry ought to endure which did not owe its origin to a majority party, and which was not responsible to the Diet. The experience in recent years has shown the strength in Japan of the desire for a real parliamentary system. On the advice of the elder statesmen, nonpartisan premiers have been appointed by the emperor or prince regent, but have been forced out of office by the Diet. So the existing cabinet crisis, occasioned by the attempted assassination, was really caused by the movement in Japan for free and responsible government. Well, you made it to the end, so here's your bonus photo. Sorry if this video was a roller coaster ride of moods, with a lot more sad stories than not sad ones. But I guess those are just the stories I randomly chose. And that previous compilation video will appear about now on your screen. Yep, there it is. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.